Hello students, and welcome to this week's lecture for Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. I'm your professor, Connor Alford, and this week we're going to begin our discussion of campaigns, elections, and voting behaviors here in the United States. As with all of our lectures, we begin by listing out our learning objectives. And this week we've got 5 major learning objectives that I want you to focus on. So the first learning objective is to explain the purpose and the importance of both elections and political campaigns in our democratic process, as well as how these political campaigns and elections are interrelated. The second learning objective is for you to discuss current trends in U.S. voter participation and the different types of difficulties, both de jure and de facto, that voters face in the United States. The third learning objective is to detail the presidential election process in our country and to discuss the main arguments both for and against this system. The fourth and penultimate learning objective is to explain how the framers who wrote our Constitution distinguished U.S. House and U.S. Senate elections and why they included these differences. Finally, we conclude with our fifth learning objective, where you are told to describe the meaning, the consequences, and the significance of each of the following terms: redistricting, gerrymandering, packing, and cracking. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that first learning objective. And to do this, we need to talk a little bit about elections and campaigns, why they are important, and what these terms mean. So we're going to start with the term election. Now, I think that all of you probably have a pretty good understanding of what an election involves. But I want you to understand that elections are important for 4 major reasons. So, of course, elections are when everyone gets together, we each cast a vote, and whoever gets the most votes is selected to serve as our leader. In other words, an election is just a process by which people elect or select a representative who will make decisions on their behalf, and the selection process takes place by getting everyone to cast votes. So that's more or less what you need to know, but again, none of this is news. However, what might be news to you is that in the modern world, elections are what makes democracy possible. Elections are the defining institution of all Western democracies in the modern world. What does that mean? Well, to explain this, we need to understand that there are really going to be 2 major categories of democracy that we can discuss and distinguish between. The most traditional form of democracy, what you might have seen, say, in ancient Athens, is what we refer to as a direct democracy. In a direct democracy, you don't actually have elections. You don't have gatherings where the citizenry gets together and selects leadership. Instead, what you're going to have is a system in which every time a government decision needs to be made, the citizens get together and they vote on that decision. So, for example, perhaps there is an ancient Athenian proposal to levy a new tax. Well, if that's the case, then every voting citizen has to come together, and they're going to vote on whether or not there should indeed be a new tax. Now, this works fine on a small scale. You could probably run a student organization of 10 or 20 students as a direct democracy. Get all the students together and have everyone cast a vote every single time your organization needs to make a decision. We've got to raise money. How do we raise money? Well, we could do a bake sale. Everyone gets together, and if a majority of us say, yeah, let's do the bake sale, we'll do the bake sale. But if a majority says, let's find some other option, we're going to look for a different option. And that's a direct democracy, and it, again, works fine on a small scale. But as you might imagine, direct democracy is very impractical at the national level in the modern world. Because modern nation states like the United States, Germany, Britain, or France tend to be quite large. And it's not practically feasible for a country the size of ours to get every voting citizen together every time any government decision needs to be made. So direct democracy on a national scale is essentially impossible in the modern world. That means that we're going to have to rely on the alternative form of democracy, the indirect or representative democracy. Now, as you might imagine, a representative democracy is defined by its elections. Because in a representative democracy, you're not going to get everyone together to vote every time a decision needs to be made. Instead, you're going to get everyone together every once in a while, let's say every 2 years or so, and they're going to vote on government decision makers. They're going to elect people who, at least in theory, will represent them in government, who will handle the day-to-day governance by making day-to-day decisions about things like whether to levy a new tax or not. And representative democracy gives people an indirect voice. It gives us an indirect degree of control over public policy, because it means that we're not going to directly decide whether to levy a new tax or create policy X versus policy Y, but we do get to select the people who make these decisions. And if we don't like how they exercise this decision-making authority, we can replace them by voting them out in the next election. So, again, a representative democracy is when you elect representatives who make government decisions on your behalf, instead of actually directly getting everyone together to make those decisions by voting. And again, in the modern world, the representative democracy is the only feasible form of democracy at the national level. Because again, our countries are very large. So elections are important first and foremost because they make modern democracy possible. Modern democracies have to be representative. Direct democracies aren't practical. And representative democracies are defined by elections. Elections are the defining institution of all modern democracies. So that's the first reason why democracy requires elections, or in other words, why elections are so important. But elections are also important because they provide government decision makers with a source of both authority and legitimacy. Remember, authority is the right to enforce decisions using coercion if you think that it's necessary. And legitimacy is a popular recognition of this right. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, why is it okay for the government to take a portion of my paycheck and use it to feed the needy, fund a library, or build a bridge, but it's not okay for my next door neighbor to take my money for any of the same purposes? Well, the government has authority. It would be theft for me to take a portion of your paycheck and use it to feed hungry children, but it's taxation when the government does so. Why? Because I don't have the right to take your money, whereas the government does. And generally speaking, we recognize this distinction. We recognize that the government has authority, whereas your next-door neighbor does not. And that's because the government is legitimate. Legitimacy is recognition by the public of your authority. And both the right to exercise power over people and the recognition of this right is given to our government in the United States through elections. Why do we have to follow the laws that Congress creates? Well, because we elected those decision makers. Remember that our Constitution describes a Republican form of government based on the social contract theory. The social contract theory tells us that the only legitimate form of government is government by the consent of the governed. In other words, authority derives from the consent of the governed. So how do we, the governed, express or withdraw our consent to be governed by, say, Donald Trump or Mark Wayne Mullen or anyone else? Well, we do so by voting for or against these individuals. If you want to withdraw your consent to being governed by Donald Trump, vote against Donald Trump in this 2020 election. But if, on the other hand, you would like to express consent, then vote for Donald Trump. That's all facilitated through the election process. Now, I do want to be clear. Governments can derive authority and legitimacy from a variety of distinct sources. Historically, for example, European monarchs derived their so-called authority and the popular recognition of that authority or legitimacy from a so-called divine right to rule. Why did the king of France have the power to control his subjects? Well, because God put him in a position of power, put him in a position to do so, and God would not have placed, say, King Louis there had he not thought that King Louis was the best person for the job. So that's where they derive their legitimacy, and we still see similar things in certain parts of the world today. In Saudi Arabia, for example, there is still a theocratic form of government where leaders claim some sort of divine authority over the people. But that doesn't fly in the Western world. If you claim a divine right to rule, or to be president, or to hold a seat in Congress, and you live in the United States, people are going to laugh at you. No one's going to take you seriously. Our government derives its authority from elections. So the second reason that elections are so important for our democracy is that they are the source of government authority and legitimacy. The third point is that elections help to co-opt potentially violent decision makers. So what does that mean? Well, to co-opt is to bring somebody in, to get them to cooperate or participate in a system, process, or team. And what we're going to discover is that elections allow for people who are dissatisfied with their government to have these grievances addressed peacefully. If you lived in Saudi Arabia and you were unhappy with how your government was being run, well, you'd either have to accept it or you'd have to go and get your guns, gather some bullets, get together a bunch of other people who are equally armed and equally angry, and you'd have to start a revolution. If you wanted to dramatically change government in, say, Russia, well, you can expect that there will be blood in the streets. But you don't have to have blood. You don't have to have warfare. You don't have to have a revolution by gunpoint in the United States if you're not happy with how our president is leading the nation. You can simply vote him, or maybe one day her, out of office. So people who might turn to violence to address their grievances will instead turn to voting. Instead of gathering bullets, we cast ballots. So elections give us a peaceful means to facilitate transition from one regime to the next, from one president to the next, and to do so in a peaceful manner. The final reason that elections are so important is that these are the tools that we have to hold our government accountable. Remember Mayhew's number one goal of the elected official. It's to get reelected. But you could broaden that. The number one goal of all political leaders is to stay in power. The reason that elected leaders are trying to get reelected is because they want to stay in power. And to do so, they need us to vote for them. But we're not going to vote for them if they don't at least sometimes give us what we want and what we need. So elections are the tools that we use to ensure that our decision makers are continuously incentivized to respond to public opinion, to popular demands. And these are the tools that we're going to use to punish those political leaders who are incompetent or untrustworthy. If they are making poor decisions that don't reflect our wants, needs, or expectations, we can hold them accountable by voting them out of office. And that means that we need to participate in elections. Without elections, there's no tool for us to kick them out of office, and therefore there's no reason for them to care what we want. There is no institutionalized or systematic incentive to remain accountable to the wants, needs, and expectations of the people. So elections, again, to summarize, are important because they make modern democracy possible. They give the government its authority and legitimacy. They co-opt potentially violent dissenters, and they keep decision makers accountable to the will of the people. But what about political campaigns? Well, to answer this question, we need to start with a definition to make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about when we say a political campaign, or campaign for short. And a political campaign can basically be defined as an attempt on the part of a candidate to get elected to an office. Of course, the term campaign is sometimes also used as a noun in reference to the particular organization or team of people assisting a particular candidate. You might hear somebody say something to the effect of the Trump campaign or the Mullen campaign. And when used in this context, the term campaign is referring to a specific group of people who work for a particular leader and are trying to help this candidate either gain or retain office. But for our purposes, understand that generally speaking, a political campaign is just an effort to get elected that's carried out on behalf of a candidate. So why are political campaigns so important? Well, political campaigns are going to be critical because they make elections meaningful. Without campaigns, elections are a mere formality. What does that mean? Why is it true? Well, what you need to understand is that you can have an election, but simply casting a vote is not an effective way to actually alter the outcome of that election. If you really want to change the outcome of an election, it's going to take more than one ballot. Because in most elections, the winning margin is substantially larger than a single vote. In most elections, if you want to change the outcome, in addition to doing the bare minimum of casting your own vote, you're going to have to get a whole bunch of other equally motivated people together, and you're going to have to work as a team to turn out not just one or two votes, but a large number of votes. And you can't do that if you're not allowed to organize a campaign, to create an organized effort to get your candidate in office or to help your candidate stay where they already are. So if we looked at, say, Russia, for example, we're going to find that on paper, Russia does have elections, and Vladimir Putin wins every time. Now, to be fair to old Putin, he is somewhat popular among many Russian people, but by and large, the real reason that Vladimir Putin wins is that they don't have associational freedoms in Russia. They don't have the First Amendment to protect their ability to do things like gather with like-minded people and speak out against the government. And if you can't organize with like-minded people and criticize those who are in power, then the chances of that you're going to get enough people to vote against the people in power to actually affect the outcome of an election, to hold those decision makers accountable and replace them, is extremely low to non-existent. So if you're not allowed to campaign, if you don't have political campaigns, then elections aren't really going to be competitive. The people who are in power will pretty much always win and stay in power. But when you do have elections with meaningful campaigns, then you can actually affect the outcome of those elections, and therefore you have real power over government. Without campaigns, elections are essentially a formality. They're utterly meaningless. So campaigns are important and related to elections first and foremost in that they give those elections their meaning. But I also want you to understand what campaigns do, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about the political campaign. At the end of the day, a political campaign is an informative or an educational organization or drive. And what I mean by that is that the primary function or activity of all campaigns is to inform voters. Now, the information that they provide isn't always complete or accurate, but they do provide us with the information that we have and that we use to make determinations about who to vote for or what to think about particular candidates. So, for example, many of you probably know that one of the big things that President Donald Trump has attempted to do as president is build a border wall along the southern border between the United States and Mexico. And he hasn't quite gotten there yet. Maybe he will by the time you watch this video. I doubt it. Or maybe he will sometime in the future. But what we're going to discover is that we knew, even before he got in office, that he was going to attempt to do this. And how did we know that? Because he and his campaign team told us that he would pursue such a policy if elected. So his campaign gave us information about his policy preferences, about the types of policies he would pursue once he got into the White House. At the same time, campaigns also provide us with information about personality. We knew a lot about the type of person that Donald Trump was well before he got elected. We knew, for example, that he was bombastic and that he sometimes made inflammatory statements. And we learned about Donald Trump not because we know him firsthand, but because his campaign helped to publicize his image. Similarly, on the other side, the candidate at that time, who represented the Democrats in the presidential race, Hillary Clinton, well, she also had a campaign. And that campaign told us a lot about the types of things she would pursue if elected. She would not build a border wall, but she would fund Planned Parenthood. She would push to increase the minimum wage. And again, we know these things not because we've spoken with Hillary Clinton personally, but because her campaign got that information out. The campaign also provided us information about her personality. But now here's where we're going to get into the importance of having multiple campaigns. Hillary Clinton's campaign is never going to tell you anything negative about Hillary Clinton's policy preferences or personality. Donald Trump's campaign is never going to tell you anything negative about his personality or policy preferences. But what we're going to discover is that you can get the positive information about Donald Trump from Donald Trump's campaign and the negative information about Donald Trump from Hillary Clinton's campaign, and vice versa. You can learn all the good things about Hillary Clinton from her campaign and its messages, and all the negative things about Hillary Clinton from Donald Trump's campaign. But at the end of the day, the information is still coming from campaigns. So if you really need to understand who you're voting for or what you're voting for in an election, you got to pay attention to the campaigns. Campaigns inform voters. And again, that makes our elections meaningful. Because if you don't know anything about the candidates or their policy, then you're just checking a random name on a ballot. It's only after you've been informed about what the options represent, about what's at stake in an election, that you can cast a meaningful ballot. And where do you get that information? Well, primarily from the campaigns that are run by the candidates themselves. So now we've more or less satisfied the primary components of that first learning objective. And at this point, we can move on and we can begin to talk about some of the trends in voter participation in the United States. Now, there are a lot of ways to measure voter participation, but we're going to focus on voter turnout. And to do that, I'm going to start by looking at the 2016 presidential election. And the reason I want to focus on this is that first, it's a presidential election year. And what we're going to discover is that during presidential elections, voter turnout tends to be higher. There are two types of election that we can talk about. The presidential election, when you have a presidential candidate on the ballot. That's what we had in 2016. That's what we will have in 2020. But then you also have what we call midterm elections, like what took place in 2018. In 2018, there were no presidential candidates on the ballot, but we did make decisions about whether to keep or replace some of our senators and all of our House representatives. So midterm elections are very important, but because there's no presidential candidate, and presidential elections tend to have the greatest degree of publicity and popular attention, turnout during presidential election cycles tends to be higher. The second reason I want to focus on 2016 is that this was a notoriously contentious election. And what we're going to discover is that voter participation, that voter turnout tends to be higher when elections are more contentious. If pretty much everyone is more or less satisfied with both of the candidates, they have a slight preference for one over the other, but wouldn't be upset if their candidate lost, then there's not a lot of incentive to vote. But if you really, really hate one candidate and or really, really love the other, then there's a lot of incentive to vote. So when an election is really contentious, when the emotions are high, that's when people start casting ballots. And emotions were definitely high in 2016. People have very strong feelings about both of the candidates. In spite of this, what we're going to find is that only about 6 out of every 10 eligible voters actually cast a ballot. So what I want to ask, and I want you to think about for just a moment, you can pause the video, is whether or not this 6 out of 10 eligible voters, 137 million ballots cast, is a high or low number. Is this good turnout? Well, to answer that question, you have to kind of think about two things. Is it high turnout compared to what? And compared to when? And the answer is that it's actually pretty good compared to most other presidential election cycles. It's not quite as high as what we got in like 2008, but it's well above average for recent presidential elections. And yet, when I tell you that this number is relative, I do also want you to understand that this is very low voter turnout compared to where we've been, and it's pretty average turnout compared to other places in the world. So, for example, if you look at the chart on the slide here, you're going to find the United States compared to the 59 other major democracies, and what we're going to discover is that we're right smack dab in the middle. So our voter turnout is not especially high, but it's not particularly low. The global average is about 65%, and ours is somewhere around 60%, higher in some years, lower in others. But again, we're very middling compared to other countries. So if we're middling, why do so many people talk so much about how terrible our voter turnout is today? Well, because if you look at the historical timeline, what you're going to find is that our voter turnout is terrible compared to where it's been in the past. So when I tell you that you need to be familiar with the general trends in voter turnout over time, I want you to understand that we're in the midst of a long-term decline in voter turnout. Now, there has been a short-term uptick. If you look at the numbers for 2012, 2016, and 2008, you're going to find that we do have some general upwards mobility. We are seeing a short-term increase in voter participation, particularly during presidential elections. But the broad trend you're going to find is substantially downward. We are nowhere near where we used to be in, say, the late 1800s or early 1900s. And this trend is especially alarming because what we're going to discover is that it's become easier to get to the voting place. It's become easier to get information with things like the internet, and legal boundaries to voting have, by and large, diminished. So, for example, prior to the 15th Amendment, African Americans could not vote. Well, now they can. Prior to the 19th Amendment, by and large, women could not vote. Well, now they can. Prior to the 26th Amendment, people who are 18, 19, or 20 years old could not vote, and now they can. So the legal limits on who can vote have declined. And the real-world obstacles to making your way to the polling place or learning about the candidates have also diminished. So we should expect to see that voter turnout is increasing, but it's actually decreasing. And to understand why it's decreasing so dramatically, you might want to look at some of the obstacles that are prohibitive, that are interfering with people's ability to cast ballots when they want to participate. Now, I'm going to urge you to be cautious about this, because there are really two major types of barrier that might prevent somebody who would like to vote from actually doing so. There are the de jure barriers, which are legal barriers, and then there are the de facto barriers, which you can think of as practical barriers. De jure means by law. De facto means by fact. And what you will discover is that both de jure and de facto barriers have diminished over time. So, for example, the major types of de jure barrier are eligibility requirements, registration requirements, and voter identification laws. And what we're going to discover is that eligibility requirements today are substantially less stringent than they used to be. So, by and large, if you are an 18-year-old U.S. citizen and you haven't been convicted of a felony, you're probably eligible to vote. But that wasn't always the case. Early in our nation's history, for example, you might have been required to own property. Later, there might have been some requisites pertinent to your personal characteristics, your race, or your gender. But today, it's more or less don't commit felonies, be 18 years or older, and be a United States citizen. If you can establish these, you're eligible to vote. But we also have registration requirements, and that basically means that at some point in advance of an election, you need to register as a voter. These have not always been around. They started during the Progressive Era, and that was in the 1800s. But what we're going to discover is that virtually all states have registration requirements of some form or another. But the stringency of these requirements has, by and large, been on the decline. We've been making it easier and easier for people to register. Today, you can register online in some states, and in other states, including Oklahoma, you can register without ever leaving your house by mail. So registration requirements are on the decline. It's easier and easier to register, and our deadlines are becoming less stringent. So, for example, in certain states, you can actually register to vote on Election Day. And this is true, say, in Colorado. It's not true in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, it's usually during October. But again, that's a pretty close due date for the registration to be turned in. Finally, we've got to talk about voter identification laws. Generally speaking, all states do require some form of identification. There's currently a debate about whether that should involve a photo identification or not. Some states do require photo IDs, including, say, South Carolina. Most states do not. Oklahoma does not require a photo ID on Election Day. Now, we don't have time to get into the debate, but I do want you to understand that there have been studies looking at some of these new laws dealing with voter identification. And there's no real evidence that they either help or hurt voter turnout among any demographics. There was some concern that it might deflate voter turnout among, say, African American voters, but again, the studies that have looked at this have not found any evidence that those states which have implemented photo ID requirements see diminished turnout among minority voters. There's no evidence that they actually successfully prevent voter fraud either. They may or may not, we don't know. But at the end of the day, voter identification laws are not a good explanation for the decline in voter turnout in our country. So these de jure barriers don't explain the trend. What about de facto barriers? Well, when you start looking at these de facto barriers, you're going to find that they too have diminished over time. So the main types of de facto barrier that might prevent somebody from voting, even if they would like to do so, are what we refer to as information costs, time costs, or transportation costs. Information costs are those costs in time, energy, effort, or money that you take on when you're trying to gather information. And what we're going to discover is that it can be very difficult to find good information about candidates. But today it's a lot easier than it used to be because we have more resources available to us. And if you don't believe me, I would encourage you to take a look in this week's optional folder, where you're going to find a whole bunch of different websites that will allow you to figure out which candidates best represent you based on your positions and how compatible your positions are with the candidates in various races, especially at the federal level. So it can still be difficult to sift through all the information to figure out what's good and what's not. But because we have more resources and are better educated than we were in the 1800s, it's still going to be substantially easier to get that information than it used to be. Information costs are still real. They're still one of the major reasons why some people don't vote. But at the end of the day, they're a lot more minor than they used to be. So this does not explain the decline in voter turnout. Time costs are also a factor, but again, not as big as they used to be. The time costs is really going to refer to the time you spend to make your way down to the polling place on election day. I don't want you to be confused. Information costs can involve the time you spend gathering information. But when we're talking about time costs, we're talking about actually on election day, how much time do you spend voting? And by and large, nowadays, thanks to things like the electronic ballot readers, it takes 15 minutes at the most to make your way to your ballot place and cast a vote. Maybe in a large urban area on a particularly packed election day, it'll take a little bit longer. But it's a very streamlined process. And for most of us, it's not a very big deal. For some of us, it can be, right? Because what we're going to discover is that elections in the United States, according to our Constitution, take place on Tuesday. And that's in the middle of the work week. So a lot of people have to take time off from work. And while there are laws that require employers to let you go vote, they don't have to pay you for that time off. And again, if it's 15 minutes, well, most of us can handle that. But if you're a single mother who works for an hourly wage, that 15 minutes of pay that you might forfeit to go and vote could be the difference between everyone getting a McChicken for dinner and somebody going hungry. Or maybe the difference between getting a pack of cigarettes and not getting a pack of cigarettes and dealing with nicotine withdrawals for the rest of the day. And faced with these types of decisions, feed your kids, get your cigarettes, or vote, most people are going to choose to feed their kids and or get their cigarettes. Nevertheless, again, time costs are not as big as they used to be. We don't have to go and fill out a ballot that can be easily read by hand, stand in line for prolonged periods of time. We've gotten very good at making this a streamlined process using modern technology. So again, time costs, not a good explanation. Same thing with transportation costs. Used to be you'd have to walk through the polling place. Now you can Uber. And usually you can Uber for free because these organizations, these private companies like Uber and Lyft, on election day tend to offer free rides. We've got more expansive public transportation. Our road systems are superior, and we've got more polling places closer to many more homes. So all of the de jure and de facto barriers are there. They're real. They're a problem. We want to alleviate them if possible. But none of these can really explain why people aren't turning out to vote. So how do we explain the long-term decline in voter participation? Well, by and large, political scientists have put forward two alternative explanations. One possibility is that people have become content. Our government has more or less found what it takes to keep people placated, to satisfy our demands, and so none of us are really upset enough to bother turning out to vote. One thing we're going to find is that voter turnout tends to be higher when people are angry with those who are currently in power, and it tends to be lower when we are content with those people in power. So maybe the reason that people aren't voting is that our governing officials are doing a pretty good job of keeping us content, of giving us enough of what we want, need, or expect from them to make sure that we stay at home and we don't bother voting. But on the other hand, there's an alternative possibility. Maybe people are alienated. Maybe we have begun to feel disenfranchised. We feel like our votes don't matter. And that's especially true in presidential elections because of what we call the Electoral College. And we'll talk about that later in this video. But by and large, what we're going to find is that we're not sure which of these explanations is better. And there's some evidence for and against each, and the answer isn't really clear or easy to define. But there are some other factors that we can talk about that we do know have played a role. So, for example, we do know that some people do feel alienated because of the polarized nature of candidates today and because of the overwhelming negativity in many campaigns. Negative political advertisements, well, they work, but they also put people off. People don't like negativity. It makes us uncomfortable. And when the candidates on both sides of an election are disparaging each other, they're slinging sand, we might walk away with a very negative impression of both. In which case, we're not going to bother supporting either candidate because we think that they're both crooks. At the same time, we might not be satisfied with our options. Because what we're going to find is that candidates are becoming more polarized. You have fewer liberal Republicans and fewer conservative Democrats. We have more extremely conservative candidates for Congress and more extremely liberal candidates for Congress. Same thing for president and for other offices around the country. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this polarization is taking place, but one thing that's worth noting is that most Americans do seem to still maintain a relatively moderate position. Remember from prior elections that a plurality of us will not choose to identify as either Republican or Democrat. We're going to register as independent. But you don't see a lot of middle-of-the-road independents who are running for president with any real chance of winning. So what we're going to find is that, again, for various reasons, candidates are more polarized, and we're being asked to choose between increasingly extreme right-wingers and on the other hand, increasingly radical left-wingers. And if you're a moderate, you might not like the extreme right-winger or the radical left-winger, and so you just don't bother voting at all. You stay at home because you've become disillusioned with the choices made available to you. To borrow a metaphor from South Park, voters often feel like we're being asked to choose between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, and when you're asked to make those kind of decisions, well, you might lose interest. You might stop paying attention because you feel like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So disinterest, disillusionment, polarization, negativity, when you speak to voters, these are a lot of the things that they cite for explaining why they don't bother to show up on Election Day. But there are some other factors that are worth taking into consideration. And in fact, the most important factor is listed at the bottom of this slide: the weakening of political parties. Political parties in the 1800s were very, very strong. There weren't very many limits on their power. And this created a lot of problems with party bosses and the party machines, and we don't have time to get into all of that. What I want you to understand is that it created issues with corruption that allowed political parties to turn out massive amounts of voters and control the elections. So to address that corruption, we began limiting the power of political parties. But as political parties lost their power, they became less capable of turning out their voters. And so voter participation declined over time. And again, that's the number one most important reason for why voter participation in our country has declined since the late 1800s. Another reason why our voter participation seems to be lower is that our population has grown. It's a lot easier to get, say, 90% of 10 people to show up and participate in an election than 90% of 1,000 people. It's easier to get 90% of 1,000 people than 90% of 1,000,000 people. Well, we're talking about a population of well over 100 million, and it's going to be very, very difficult to get large portions of our population to turn out when the population itself is so large. So if we jump back a couple slides and we look at this chart that's comparing the United States to other democracies, notice that some of the democracies that do really, really well have very small populations. Vietnam, Laos, so on and so forth. Some of the other ones aren't really fair comparisons. So, for example, you're going to see that in fourth place, we've got Australia. But in Australia, there are laws that actually fine people who don't vote. So is it really fair to compare the United States to Australia, where people are being forced to at least fill out a ballot randomly? I don't know. But again, one thing we're going to find is that as your population gets bigger, your overall voter turnout tends to decline. And so the fact that our population today is so much larger than it used to be, it does help to explain why the percentage of voters who participate each election cycle is lower than it used to be. Okay, so now we've talked about the meaning and importance and the relationship of both elections and political campaigns. We've talked about voting trends and some of the reasons for those trends and some of the barriers that our constituents or voters are facing when they try to participate on election day. Now what we're going to start to do for the remainder of this video is talk about some of the rules that structure our elections and some of the consequences of these rules, as well as some of the arguments for and against them. And we're going to begin by looking at presidential elections before matriculating into congressional elections. So what you see on your slide right now is a map of the 2016 presidential election based on which states threw their support behind which candidates. And there's a few things that you're going to notice. First, you're going to notice that every state is colored either red or blue, except for Maine, which is red and blue. You're also going to notice that every state is assigned a number. For example, Texas has 38 and Oklahoma has 7. In order to interpret this map and to understand what it's telling us, we need to understand something called the Electoral College. And we need to understand that in the United States, presidential elections take place in a set of 2 distinct phases. So the Electoral College is a group of 538 electors chosen by the various states who will come together every December of a presidential election cycle, and these electors are the ones who are actually going to choose who the president is. But don't get confused. Make sure you watch your videos for this week, because what we're going to find is that even though the electors at the end of the day get to decide who the president is, that does not mean that the public, the average voter, does not have any say. Instead, what we're going to find is that our influence on who becomes president is ultimately indirect, because again, in our system, the president is selected in a series of 2 steps. So the first step or phase is what we refer to as the November elections. Notice that this is plural, the November elections. The reason that I'm emphasizing elections, plural, and not just election, is that there is no single popular vote to decide who the president of our country will be. I'm going to say that again, and I want you to make sure it's in your notes. There is no national popular vote to decide who the president is going to be. Sometimes we hear people say things like Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Not true. There was no popular vote in our country. It is true to say that Hillary Clinton got more votes nationwide than did Donald Trump. And we'll talk about some of the specific numbers as we move forward. But no, Hillary Clinton did not win the popular vote for president because there was no popular vote for president, and we don't know how people would have behaved were it the case that we did have a popular vote. It would change voter behavior, again, in a number of ways that we'll discuss as we move forward. But during this first November phase of presidential election season, we have 51 separate, purely popular votes. And there are 51 of these votes because we have one for each of the 50 states and one for Washington, D.C. During the November phase, every citizen in each state is going to participate in their respective state election. And during that time, you, as well as every other eligible voter in our country, will have an opportunity to cast a vote in the presidential election process. But I want you to understand that in the November election, you're not actually voting for who will be the president of the United States. Instead, you're voting to determine who your state will select as its electors in the Electoral College. If you vote for Donald Trump, for example, you are actually voting for a group of individuals who were handpicked by Donald Trump's party to participate in the Electoral College during the second phase of the presidential selection process if Donald Trump wins in that particular state. So, for example, in Oklahoma, we have 7 electors in the Electoral College. Donald Trump won the popular vote in the November election for our state. So Donald Trump's party got to choose all 7 of our state's electors. And what that means is that when we proceed to the second step, you can bet that Donald Trump is going to get Oklahoma's electoral support. How does this work? Well, the second phase of the presidential selection process is what we call the December election. And this is when the 538 electors selected by the 50 states and Washington, D.C. come together. Each elector casts one ballot, and whichever candidate gets a majority vote from the Electoral College becomes the president of the United States. Donald Trump's party got to choose all 7 of Oklahoma's electors after winning Oklahoma's popular vote in November. No surprise, during the December election, all 7 of Oklahoma's electors cast their support for Donald Trump. On the other hand, Hillary Clinton won California's popular vote in November, so Hillary Clinton got to choose California's 55 electors, and lo and behold, in December, Hillary Clinton got 55 electoral votes from California. But this raises another question. Why is it that Oklahoma gets 7 votes and California gets 55 votes? Well, the number of electors that a state gets in the Electoral College is equal to its congressional delegation. That means that every state automatically gets at least 2 electors for their representation in the Senate. Because remember from prior lecture that every state gets exactly 2 elected officials in the Senate, that these senators represent the entire state, and that the number of senators a state gets is not responsive to that state's population. But then at the same time, each state gets 1 elector for each of its representatives in the House of Representatives. And the number of representatives you get is proportional to population. So, for example, Oklahoma has 5 representatives because we have a population of about 4.5 million. So we have 5 representatives and 2 senators. That gives us 2 votes in the Electoral College every December during a presidential election season. California gets 2 votes in the Electoral College for its Senate, but its population is about 10 times larger than us, so they also get about 10 times as many representatives in the House, 53 compared to our 5. And they get 1 extra vote in the Electoral College for each of those 53 representatives that they receive in the House. That gives California a total of 55 votes in the Electoral College versus Oklahoma's 7. So what we're going to discover is that there are 535 representatives and senators in our government. That means there are 535 electors, plus an additional 3 electors who are selected by Washington, D.C., to give us a total of 538. But one thing that is worth noting, at least briefly, is that while each state is worth a certain number of electoral votes, and while it is true to say that the November elections, which decide who gets to cast those electoral votes, are purely democratic, this process is not itself perfectly democratic, because what we're going to find is that in every state except Nebraska and Maine, we use a purely winner-takes-all system. And what that means is that the candidate who gets the most votes in, say, Oklahoma or California, or really any state that isn't Nebraska or Maine, gets to choose all of that state's electors in the Electoral College, and will therefore almost certainly get 100% of that state's support in the December election. But it's very rare that you get 100% of the support from a state's population in the November election. So let's go back to our map and let's look at Oklahoma, for example. Donald Trump won the popular vote in Oklahoma during the 2016 presidential election cycle. He got more votes than Hillary Clinton. So he got to choose all 7 of our electors, and all 7 of our electors supported him in December. But Donald Trump didn't come anywhere close to getting 100% of the popular vote in Oklahoma. Donald Trump in November got about 65% of the popular vote from Oklahoman ballots, whereas Hillary Clinton got about 30% and the Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson got about 5 or 6%. Bottom line, that means that about 35% of of Oklahomans voted against Donald Trump. And yet Donald Trump got 100% of the Oklahoman vote in the December election. So what that means is that the candidate whose party is in the majority for your state will, in almost all cases, get all of your state's support in the December election. And some people find that problematic for reasons that we'll discuss moving forward. It's also important to understand that the Electoral College opens up the possibility that an election will be decided by what we call faithless electors. A faithless elector is a member of the Electoral College who, in the December election, casts a vote for any candidate other than the candidate who got the majority of that state's vote in the November election. So, for example, if one of Oklahoman's electors had voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, we would have called this elector a faithless elector. And what we're going to discover is that there is no federal penalty prohibiting this type of activity. There are some state penalties, but they tend to be quite modest, and they're not present here in Oklahoma. So an Oklahoma elector has no legal requirement to support the candidate that actually got to choose them because he or she won the majority vote in that state. Now that's interesting, but I don't want to overstate it. It might be a problem on principle, but I do want to be clear. At no point in our nation's history has the outcome of a presidential election ever been determined by faithless electors. We have a small number of faithless electors in virtually every presidential election cycle. But at no point in history have there ever been enough faithless electors to actually change the outcome of an election. And that's because, again, you got to remember that the party whose candidate wins the popular vote for a state in November gets to handpick the individuals that represent that state in the Electoral College come December. And the Republicans who got to select the 7 electors for Oklahoma would not have picked these individuals if they did not trust them to support Donald Trump. They only picked them because they could be trusted to support Donald Trump, and lo and behold, that's exactly what they did. So faithless electors are a real thing, but so far they're more of a problem in theory or in principle than in practice. Now, I do need to briefly note that I've already told you that every state except Nebraska and Maine uses a winner-takes-all system. So how does Nebraska and Maine handle the Electoral College? Well, basically, they use a proportional system, which means that the percentage of a state's electors that a particular candidate gets to select is going to be proportional to the percentage of the popular vote that he or she received during the November elections. So for easy math, let's imagine that Maine had exactly 10 electors in the Electoral College. As you can see, it doesn't. It has 4. But let's say that it had exactly 10. Let's say Donald Trump got exactly 10% of the vote and Hillary Clinton got exactly 90% of the vote. Again, that's not actually what happened. Well, if that were the case in a purely proportional system, Donald Trump would get to choose 1 of the 10 electors. Hillary Clinton would get to choose the other 9. And that would mean that come December, Hillary Clinton would probably get 9 electoral votes from Maine, and Donald Trump would only get 1. There are a lot of people who think that we should use this on a nationwide basis, that every individual state should adopt that system. Because, by the way, every state does get to decide how to select its electors. But every state except Nebraska and Maine has chosen to use the winner-takes-all system. And we're going to talk about why that might be problematic as we move forward. But before we do, there is another clarification that needs to be made. I don't want you to get confused about how we determine who the president will be come December. During the December election, it's not enough to get more votes than anybody else. That's, generally speaking, sufficient in the November election. Donald Trump got more votes than any other candidate in Oklahoma, so he is said to have won the Oklahoma popular vote for November. But in the Electoral College, it's not enough to get more votes than anyone else. You have to get a majority. That means that you need at least 270 out of the 538 electors to support you. And while it's going to be true that in an election where you have 2 candidates, the candidate who gets the most votes will always have the majority, that is not true if your election has more than 2 viable candidates. If you have 3 viable candidates, for example, it's possible that 2 candidates will each get 30% of the vote, and a third candidate will get 40% of the vote. Now, 30 plus 30 is 60, plus 40 is 100. So that's the entire voter base. But what you'll notice is that while one candidate got a plurality, one candidate got 40%, which is more than any other candidate, no candidate got a majority, which is more than 50%. And that means that in such a circumstance, no candidate would have won the minimum 270 votes necessary to be elected president through the December election. In such a case, the Constitution tells us that the election is going to be thrown to the House. And the House will get to choose from the top 3 vote getters of the December election who they will choose. And this reality continues to shape how presidential candidates run their campaigns, especially for third parties. So, for example, in 2016, Gary Johnson knew that there was not a snowball's chance in hell that he would get 270 electoral votes. So instead, he tried to snag 1 or 2 states, just enough electoral votes to keep either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton from getting the majority, so that the election would have been thrown to the House of Representatives. And Gary Johnson was hoping that the Republicans would never choose Hillary Clinton, that the Democrats would never choose Donald Trump, and that they would instead agree upon Gary Johnson as a third-party compromise. Now, I don't know if that would have happened, but I do know that it didn't happen, because Gary Johnson wasn't able to grab even 2 states. He did not get enough votes to keep either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton from getting the majority. And even if he had taken the states he was planning to grab, Donald Trump still would have gotten the majority. Donald Trump still would have won. But while his strategy didn't pay off, this has happened twice in our nation's history. Thomas Jefferson lost the December election, but he became president because he was selected by the House. Similarly, in 1824, none of the candidates for president secured the minimum 270 votes to win, and so John Quincy Adams was selected by the House of Representatives. And that's how we are going to resolve a situation where no candidate gets the minimum 270 votes to win in the December election. All right, now we've got to begin talking about why we have this system, because it does seem a little bit Byzantine and esoteric. It's unnecessarily complicated, many people would argue. But what we're going to discover is that the Electoral College is in our Constitution. Like it or hate it, it's right there. You can find it. And that wasn't an accident. The inclusion of an Electoral College in the presidential selection process by the framers who wrote our Constitution was a deliberate decision. And to understand this, we need to think a little bit first about the Constitutional Convention itself. Remember what I've told you in the past. At the Constitutional Convention, we had 55 delegates from different backgrounds and different states representing different interests, voters, and expectations. And they all had different ideas about how to run our government. So to get anything done, these people had to come together and compromise. Our Constitution was a negotiated document. It was a product of controversy and compromise. The controversy was when the opposing factions each proposed a radical option that the other side was unwilling to accept. The compromise was when they met somewhere in the middle, or went with a third option that both sides were willing to accept. And in the case of the Electoral College, we've really got two major proposals that were put forward. First, there were those who suggested we should use a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, the president is a member of the legislature. In a parliamentary system, the legislature will select one of its own members to serve as what you will call a prime minister. And the prime minister is going to serve as the chief executive while at the same time being a part of the legislative branch and at the same time having all the same powers and responsibilities. In such a system, the prime minister can be replaced by a vote of parliament or Congress or the legislative branch. And the framers wholeheartedly rejected this proposal for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was too similar to what they had escaped that was happening in Britain. But number two, and more importantly, the parliamentary system is fundamentally incompatible with the constitutional principle of separated powers. Remember, the framers who wrote our Constitution didn't want the executive and the legislative power to be concentrated in any one branch of government. And in a parliamentary system, that's exactly what happens. Because the prime minister, or the president, is a member of the parliament or the legislature in a parliamentary system, we're going to find that he has both legislative and executive power, and therefore this doesn't work for people who want a separation of powers. So that idea was rejected. The alternative proposal was to have a popular election. But this too was rejected for a few reasons. Number one, remember that while our framers who wrote the Constitution were concerned about too much government, about not having enough power of the people in government, they were also concerned about too much democracy. They were afraid of a tyranny of the majority. Thomas Jefferson famously compared it to two wolves and a sheep getting together to vote on what's for dinner. In a tyranny of the majority, a bare majority of a nation's population will use its sheer force of numbers to push through a policy that will essentially exploit a large minority for the benefit of the majority. So, for example, 51% of the population in a pure democracy could get together and it could vote to enslave the other 49%. That would be a purely democratic decision, but it wouldn't be consistent with our constitutional Republican system of government, where the government, popularly elected or not, is subject to certain legal limitations, and individuals have the protection of certain liberties, even when those liberties are contrary to what the majority would like. And what the framers recognized was that the president doesn't just serve as chief executive. The president serves as the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. And so if a 51% majority got together and elected the right candidate, they could select a candidate who would abuse his or her power over the military to enslave that other 49% or to exploit that other 49%, creating a tyranny of the majority. They didn't want that. And so they decided a popular vote was not an acceptable option. At the same time, remember that these were establishment politicians. These were experienced statesmen. They were exceptionally well educated and very wealthy for the time, and they didn't think that the majority of the population was. They recognized that the president's primary duties involved military affairs, international diplomacy, foreign relations, and security. And that these were very, 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 very complicated, difficult issues that your average voter just doesn't have much information about. This was definitely true at the time. Remember, there was no public education. Most people were illiterate. Almost nobody had a college degree. But even today, if we're honest, I think most of us would acknowledge that we don't have enough information to know exactly what is in the best interest of our country, given the unique geopolitical economy of the world. Most of us don't have enough information to know how to run a war or to handle complex game theory while managing international relations. And when you acknowledge that, it seems to make sense that perhaps we would want a group of educated, qualified statespersons who could step in, who could intervene if a candidate was able to get elected by swaying the sort of unwashed masses. Now, again, I don't know that you agree with any of these arguments. I don't know if you find them compelling. That's not the point. I want you to understand the reasoning that the framers articulated at the Constitutional Convention. They were afraid that the masses didn't have access to enough information to make a good decision, and the Electoral College was included in part, to account for that. But largely, the most important reason why we included the Electoral College had to do with this urban versus rural, northern versus southern divide. Because what we're going to discover is that this last point on the slide is closely related to that tyranny of the majority. The framers did not want a president of the urban states or a president of the northern states. They wanted a president of the United States. And they were afraid that if we went to a purely popular vote system, then the presidents or the candidates who ran for president would have no reason, no incentive to pay attention to the wants, needs, or expectations of voters from rural states that have very few people. Instead, they would focus almost entirely on the wants, needs, and expectations of voters from the largely populated, highly urbanized areas in our country. So to illustrate the logic of this argument, let's look at a couple of slides. On the right side of this slide, you're going to see that about 51% of the nation's population lives in one of four states: California, Texas, Florida, and New York. And so what that means is that if you were in a purely popular vote system, running as a candidate for president, you could win the election by promising to do everything that the voters of these four states wanted at the expense of the country as a whole and at the expense of every other state. The wants, needs, and expectations of these rural states are not the same as the wants, needs, and expectations of the urban states. And the framers wanted to create a system that required a candidate to get at least some of the large states and at least some of the small states to vote for him or her if he or she was going to become the president. Why? Well, because that would ensure that whoever won did so by promising to give at least a little bit to some of the urban states and at least a little bit to some of the rural states. In other words, the Electoral College was a way to build coalitions, to ensure that you had a president that considered the best interest of the country as a whole, that took into consideration both the small states and the large states. Because in the Electoral College system, you cannot win just by getting the small states to support you or just by getting the big states to support you. You need a combination of the two. So if you look at that 2016 presidential election map, you're going to find that's really why Donald Trump won. Donald Trump was able to build a coalition by campaigning on a set of issues that was appealing in some ways to urban voters and in other ways to rural voters. Donald Trump's winning coalition involved a number of small states like Wyoming and Oklahoma, but it also included some big states like Pennsylvania, Texas, and Florida. Whereas Hillary Clinton grabbed very, very few small states. She grabbed a few medium-sized states, but by and large, Hillary Clinton's entire winning margin came from one really, really big state, the most populated state in the country, California. So if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side of the screen, it's going to compare the popular and electoral votes of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And it's going to do so in two ways. And the first of these columns on the far left is going to break it down based on the exact vote count. And what you're going to find is that Hillary Clinton did get about 3 million more votes than did Donald Trump. And by the way, that's actually a fairly large winning margin. Presidential elections are a lot closer than that in most cases. So Hillary Clinton did do pretty well. But if you drop out California, if you don't count any of the Californian votes for Clinton or for Trump or for any other candidate, you're going to find that the results change. In this case, Donald Trump would have beaten out Hillary Clinton by 2 million votes. That's because, again, Hillary Clinton offered a lot to urban voters, but she made very little effort to offer policies that catered to the wants, the needs, the expectations, values, or beliefs of people from smaller states. So Hillary Clinton did really, really well in New York. She did extremely well in California. But she did not do very well in the small states, in rural areas, where she was extremely unpopular because she didn't offer anything to those people. Again, Donald Trump was able to win by building coalitions, by uniting some small states with some big states. Hillary Clinton lost because she would have only, based on her promises and policies and the perceptions of voters, supported the wants, needs, and expectations of a couple very large states and very urban areas. And this disparity becomes even more glaring if you break it down by counting. So on this chart, what we're going to find is that the 146 counties, here shaded in blue, represent about 51% of the United States population. And what that means is that if you were in a purely popular vote system, a presidential candidate could win by focusing 100% of their campaign efforts on these 146 counties and essentially ignoring every other portion of the country. So the wants, needs, and expectations of voters in the gray areas could effectively and safely be ignored by all candidates running for president. And in that case, again, we're going to have some problems. Because as you might imagine, the wants, needs, and expectations of the voters in these gray areas are going to be distinct from those of the voters in these extremely highly urbanized, very metropolitan areas. And so the question that you have to ask yourself is that if we had a popular vote system where every president was selected by the voters from the blue areas, what incentive would the voters from the gray areas have to participate, to continue being a part of this union? Well, they probably wouldn't have much at all because, again, there would be no chance that they really had of ever electing a president who even kind of cared about what they wanted, needed, or expected. But here's the thing. We don't want these rural areas to feel disenfranchised. We don't want those urban areas to feel disenfranchised either. We want to make sure that all voters, urban or rural, are satisfied enough with the government that they're willing to work together and remain united in a single country with a single president. Because we recognize that we're stronger together. The urban and the rural voters need each other. Rural voters need places to ship their crops. Urban voters need people to give them food. And what we're going to discover is that the Electoral College forces us to work together in selecting our president so that we can remain united. It is worth noting that although the framers weren't able to access this information, a number of recent studies in the realm of international relations shows that in large and diverse countries like our own, when you have a popular electoral system for the chief executive or for the chief military commander in a country, this tends to lead to civil wars and conflict as well as instability. So you're going to notice that a lot of countries in our world are going to use the parliamentary system. We're going to be the only country that uses the electoral system, but there aren't that many systems that represent large, diverse countries and yet have a popularly elected commander-in-chief or chief executive. So the popular vote system sounds appealing at first, but hopefully some of these arguments will give you food for thought. But it's also important to recognize the other side. So I've given you the arguments for the Electoral College. But to completely satisfy our learning objective, you also need to know the arguments against it. And they're just as plentiful. There are a lot of reasons to be upset here, and the first, most obvious, is that the Electoral College is simply unfair. It's not purely democratic, because what we're going to discover is that it tends to inflate the voice of voters from rural states. And to illustrate how this works, let's look at this slide, where we have some dated numbers. These are a little outdated, but the proportional representation here is approximately equivalent. So what we're going to find is that the information on your slide right now compares California, the most populated state, to Wyoming, the least populated state. California has 55 electoral votes compared to Wyoming's 3. Well, that seems fair. California has a lot more representation in December than does Wyoming because California has way more people than does Wyoming. But remember that the population of California is something like 45 million, and if you do out the division, you're going to find that that means that there is one elector in the Electoral College, one vote in the December election, for every 705,454 Californians. Whereas in Wyoming, we have about 500,000 people and 3 electoral votes. And what that means is that it's going to take about 194,717 Wyomingites to equal a single electoral vote. In other words, what we're going to discover is that a single Wyoming voter has about 3 times as much representation in the Electoral College as a single California voter. And if you're from California, that's going to be aggravating. Now, again, if you're from a rural state like Wyoming or Oklahoma, this works in your favor. But it's not fair that simply because of where you live, your vote counts as more. Now, again, understand that there are reasons why the Electoral College was designed in this way. Remember that the idea here is to require presidential candidates to cater to the wants, needs, and expectations of rural voters on at least some issues and in some ways, which you cannot do in a purely popular vote system because there are more people in the urban areas. But if you inflate the voice of people from rural areas, you give them just enough power to ensure that they're being represented. But again, end of the day, you do so at the expense of people from large states. So that's not equal. It's discriminatory, plain and simple. And that's an argument against the Electoral College for many people. The next major argument against the Electoral College that is commonly put forward by its opponents is that it's Byzantine and esoteric or confusing. In other words, people don't have any idea what we're actually voting on. It's taken me a lot of time just to explain how this system works. It would be a lot simpler if we just got everyone together, everyone cast a vote, and then whoever got the most votes won. And that would be a very, very simple process. Instead, we're going to have a 2-stage process where each state is assigned a certain number of electors, so on and so forth. Then you vote on who. We don't know what we're voting for in November. Most of us think that we're voting for who will be our president, but in reality, we're voting for which presidential candidate's party gets to select the people who get to select the person who will be the president. That's a very, very indirect, convoluted, confusing system. And for some people, that's reason enough to abolish or at least amend the Electoral College. Finally, what we're going to find is that the Electoral College does indeed diminish voter turnout, in particular among a state's minority party members. So, for example, if we jump all the way back to this map of the Electoral College, you're going to find that Donald Trump got 100% of Oklahoma's 7 electoral votes, even though Hillary Clinton got something like 30% of our popular vote. Now, what that means is that if you were a Democrat and you voted in Oklahoma, your vote did not actually impact the results of the December election. In other words, you didn't really have any say in who would become the president. And most people recognize that reality. They know that there is no chance in hell that a Democratic presidential candidate is going to win in Oklahoma anytime soon. And recognizing that, a lot of Oklahoman Democrats choose to stay home on Election Day when they might otherwise have participated because they don't feel like their vote would make a difference. And they're probably right. The same thing is true of Republicans in very blue states like California. Republicans in California don't usually bother showing up because, again, they know that there's absolutely no chance that their candidate, the Republican candidate, will get more votes than the Democrat candidate, and they know that whoever gets the most votes will absolutely get every single vote in the December election. So what we're going to discover is that if you use a system like Maine's or Nebraska, where you allot the proportion of electors selected by a candidate's party according to the proportion of the popular vote they receive, you start to see more minority party members participating. Republicans are a minority in Maine, and yet they were able to secure an entire electoral vote for Donald Trump. In other words, if we were to amend the Electoral College such that every single state were to use this proportional system, or if we shifted to a purely popular vote system, there would be a reason for Democratic voters in Oklahoma to cast ballots in presidential elections, and the same could be true of Republican voters in California. So The Electoral College does not provide equal representation. It underrepresents people from large states, overrepresents those from small states. It's Byzantine and esoteric, so that people don't know what we're voting for, and it diminishes voter turnout, especially among minority party members. These are the main arguments against the Electoral College, and we're almost done. But now we need to talk a little bit about congressional elections, and this is a little bit more complicated. Because remember that the legislative branch of our government, Congress, is bicameral, meaning that it has been divided into two separate chambers, each comprised of its own set of elected officials. We have the Senate with 100 senators, and we have the House of Representatives with 435 representatives. And the election systems that we use to select these senators, on the one hand, those representatives, on the other hand, are distinct from one another. They were designed to be distinct, and these distinctions are written directly into the Constitution. Now, this lecture is running a little long, and I've already written out the main differences separating the House from the Senate on the slide, so I won't read them out to you on this video, although they are accessible to you in the book and through some of our optional resources and videos. What I want you to understand is that by and large, the House of Representatives operates on an electoral system that makes each member very responsive to public opinion, and it allows each member to represent a small group of voters organized into geographical regions called congressional districts. And the reason that the House of Representatives was designed in this way is that the House of Representatives was made to be the voice of the people. In other words, the House of Representatives is there to give us instructed delegates. Remember from prior lecture that an instructed delegate is an elected official who simply gives the voters what they want. He doesn't pay attention to what he or she, in his or her expert judgment and moral soundness of mind, thinks is in our best interest. He just gives us what we tell him. If we say raise taxes, he votes to raise taxes. If we say jump, she asks how high. And to ensure that they provided this, that they gave us this voice in government, we have the House of Representatives with a very particular set of electoral rules. But remember that the framers were also afraid that we were unwashed, that we didn't know what was in our own best interest, and that what we want and what we need are not always the same. So to ensure that we also have trustees in government, we get the Senate. The Senate is meant to be the mind of the people, and it's meant to be a little bit more insulated from public opinion, so that the individuals who serve in the Senate can focus on what we need rather than what we want without fear of being voted out of office immediately after. So, for example, senators serve for 6 years compared to 2 years for the House of Representatives. And what we're going to find is that the Senate is therefore more insulated. It's less responsive to sweeping changes in public opinion, and since it's more insulated from changes in public opinion, it can think more about what makes sound policy and less about what's politically expedient or popular at the time. So the Senate, again, is going to be the mind of the people, where we get trustees. And remember, trustees are people who don't give the people what they want, but rather they give the people what they think those people need. They are going to use their expert judgment and soundness of moral character to make the right decisions independent of what is popular based on our judgment. So we get one of each. We get the trustees in the Senate, and we get the delegates in the House of Representatives. But among the many differences that were built into the systems for electing representatives and senators, we're going to find again that representatives are elected by congressional districts. Each state is divided into a certain number of congressional districts based on its population, and each of those districts gets one representative. Whereas senators are elected at large, meaning that each senator is going to represent an entire state. Now, every state gets 2 senators, but we don't elect them simultaneously, and each of these senators is going to have to respond to everything that all of their voters want, because every single voter in our state has the option to decide, for example, whether we want to keep or replace Inhofe in 2020. That's not true of Markwayne Mullin. He is also up for re-election in 2020, but only those of us who live in Oklahoma's 2nd congressional district are going to get to vote on whether to keep or replace Markwayne Mullin, whereas every Oklahoman gets a chance to make that decision for Inhofe or Langford. And what that means is that, again, the representatives are able to respond more directly to the people. Because they have fewer voters, it's easier for them to represent those voters. But it's also going to open up a series of problems that were never originally foreseen. So what we're going to discover is that we want each of the congressional districts around our country to have approximately the same number of people. It would not be fair if, say, Texas District 1 had 10 people and Oklahoma District 5 had 4.5 million people, because then each would get one representative, and that would give a much, much stronger voice to the 10 voters in the 1st District of Texas than to the voters who live in the 5th District of Oklahoma. So every single one of the 435 districts in our country is going to get one representative, and each one needs to have approximately the same number of voters. We're talking about 435,000 or so. But what we will also discover is that the number of people living in a particular district is going to change over time. As populations grow or shift from one place to the next, the districts become lopsided. And to account for this, we have to periodically redraw the boundaries reflecting population changes. So that if a whole bunch of people move from District 1 to District 2, District 2 gains in representation and District 1 loses representation. What we're going to discover, however, is that while redistricting involves redrawing the boundaries of congressional districts to ensure equal representation, to ensure that each district is approximately equal in its overall number of voters, there's also a form of redistricting called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the process of dividing and redrawing congressional district lines to give your party an advantage. The reason that gerrymandering takes place is that the process of redrawing congressional districts is, by our Constitution, relegated to the states. That means that each state gets to decide on the boundaries of its own congressional districts. And so, for example, in Oklahoma, we have a state legislature in which both chambers have a supermajority of Republicans. And our congressional staff is not the only group of people who are going to be dominated by the Republicans. All of our statewide officers are Republicans. Our governor, Kevin Stitt, is a Republican. And when you take all of this into consideration, basically what that means is that after we conduct this census in 2020, the Republicans get to draw the boundaries of Oklahoma's congressional districts. Now, it is worth noting that historically, Oklahoma doesn't actually have as big of a problem with gerrymandering as some other states. But I want you to think about what happens when you allow Republicans to draw the boundaries in Republican states and Democrats to draw the boundaries in Democratic states, like California or New York, where gerrymandering is a much bigger problem. Well, what we're going to discover in that case is that Democrats have an incentive to draw boundaries that will help them to win. Republicans have an incentive to draw boundaries that will help them to win. And when they try to do so, this is what we call gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is notoriously difficult to measure or prove and extremely difficult to regulate. And we don't actually know how it affects the outcome of elections. It could be a really big deal. It could be a very small deal. It could be a modest matter. We don't know. It might not have any effect at all. But there's strong theoretical reason to think that it could be problematic. And to fully understand that, I'm going to refer you to the video from TED Talks that I've included as required viewing for this week's lecture. Now, again, because this is going on quite long in this lecture, I'm not going to go into the details right here. I do want you to watch that TED Talks video to learn more about gerrymandering. I also have included a video from Prager University about the Electoral College and why we might want to keep it. One thing that I want you to understand as you go in and you watch this TED Talks video is that TED Talks is a left-leaning think tank. One thing that I want you to keep in mind as you go and you watch this Prager University video is that Prager University is a right-wing think tank. Keep in mind as you pay attention to what is articulated in these videos that the speakers and the writers and the presenters are coming from their own political perspective. But the information contained within these videos is very important. And as you watch the TED Talks video, I want you to pay careful attention to the distinction between packing and cracking, because you'll need that for our exam, and because you're also going to need that for this week's assessment. As you go into the PragerU video, I want you to pay careful attention to the structure of presidential elections and to the arguments presented for it. Now understand, again, there are arguments presented against it that might not receive as much attention. But because those are easier to understand, and because the arguments for the Electoral College are a little bit more difficult and historically relevant to the thinking of the framers who wrote our Constitution, I've gone ahead and included the video. Just remember, take the TED Talks and the PragerU University video with caution. And all right, that's the end of this lecture. I hope you all have a nice week, and I will see you on the next one.